Welcome to Tech Bytes and News, your daily roundup of articles featured in Hacker News. Today, we're diving deep into setting up a gaming HVM on QubesOS. It's a complex process, but the rewards are worth the effort. Let's get started.
I'm eager to hear this. From what I understand, it involves significant hardware and software configuration. What are the essential hardware requirements?
Absolutely. First, you need a dedicated GPU. Crucially, a secondary one separate from your DOM0's display GPU. NVIDIA and AMD GPUs are currently supported. Intel support is untested. Think of it like giving your gaming VM its own dedicated graphics card. Also, you'll need a lot of patience. GPU passthrough isn't exactly plug and play.
Right, patience is key. And what about the other hardware? Is a dedicated monitor essential?
Not strictly essential, no. You could use a single monitor and switch inputs, but a dedicated screen, mouse, and keyboard are highly recommended for a smoother experience. It simplifies things considerably.
Makes sense. So after the hardware, what's the next hurdle? IOMMU groups?
Precisely. Understanding IOMMU groups is vital. It helps identify devices sharing the same IOMMU group as your GPU, which can aid in troubleshooting. You need to boot a live Linux distribution, enable IOMMU in GRB using parameters like IOMMU equals 1, IOMMU underscore AMD equals on, and then use a script to map out the IOMMU group structure. It's a bit involved, but it's a crucial diagnostic step.
So essentially, we're figuring out what hardware resources are sharing the same bus. Right? That's important for avoiding conflicts.
Exactly. After that, we need to hide the secondary GPU from DOM0 using QubesOS PCI to get its device ID, then modify the grub configuration to hide it. This prevents conflicts and ensures the GPU is exclusively available to the HVM. But be warned, a reboot after this step might leave you stuck if you've made a mistake.
Oh boy, that sounds intense. What about RAM limitations? I've heard something about a max RAM below 4 GB parameter.
Ah, yes. That's a quirk related to how memory is addressed in 32-bit and 64-bit systems. Newer QubesOS versions, R4.2 and later, don't require any special configuration for this. But older versions might need a workaround. You might need to adjust the max RAM below 4 GB parameter based on your GPU's BAR size, which you can find using LSPCI. It's a bit of trial and error, unfortunately.
Trial and error, huh? Sounds like a fun debugging session. Is there a more straightforward way to handle this parameter?
Well, there's a method involving patching the stubdom-linux root fsgz file, which modifies the QEMU command line to include the max RAM below 4 GB parameter dynamically. There's also a script available to automate this process, but it requires careful review before use. It's powerful, but it's also a bit risky if you don't understand what you're doing.
I see. So after all that, we finally get to setting up the guest VM itself. Linux or Windows?
For 2023, a Linux guest is generally recommended. It's easier to debug driver issues. You'll need to use the guest distribution's kernel and install the appropriate GPU drivers. There are even automated scripts to help with this part. Windows is possible, but debugging is significantly harder.
Makes sense. Linux offers more control and transparency. And once the guest is set up, how do we actually pass the GPU?
You pass the GPU through QubesOS settings using QubesOS PCI attach. You might need additional options like permissive or no strict reset depending on your hardware. Again, this is where you might encounter significant debugging challenges. Prepare for intense suffering.
Intense suffering, you say? Sounds thrilling. What are some common issues people run into?
Oh, plenty. Driver issues are common, especially with MSI calls. You might need to use workarounds like PCI equals NOMC or experiment with different drivers. For NVIDIA, NVIDIA-Open is often recommended. And remember, sudo dmesg is your best friend for troubleshooting kernel logs.
dmesg, got it. And what about audio and display configuration if I'm using a dedicated monitor and peripherals?
If you have a dedicated setup, you'll need to configure Xorg, install the necessary input drivers for your keyboard and mouse, and create an x.org.conference file. This file needs to be dynamically updated with the correct bus ID after each reboot. There are scripts to automate this, but it's still quite involved. Audio setup often involves pulse audio or pipewire configuration, which can also be tricky.
Wow, this is a lot more complicated than I initially thought. Are there any resources to help with debugging?
Absolutely. The QubesOS forum is a great resource, as are the links provided in the original guide. There's also an automated script available to streamline much of the process. But again, proceed with caution. Remember to always back up your system before making significant changes.
Excellent advice. Thanks for this comprehensive overview. It's clear this isn't a task for the faint of heart.
You're very welcome. It's a challenging but rewarding process. Remember to consult the documentation and community resources throughout. And good luck. That's all for Tech Bytes and News today. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.